I'm Dr. Brooke Bro. This talk, Agree to Disagree, was made possible by the hard work of many people, including members of my Cognition and Psycholinguistics Research Lab, but especially Dr. Robert Michael, as well as Natalie Dauphiné. My research focuses on lexical semantics. This is just a fancy way of saying that I'm interested in word meaning. When you think of word meaning, you probably think about dictionary definitions. When I think of word meaning, I think about what information you have in your head. But what does that even mean? Well, I look at word meaning through a cognitive lens. My research focuses on attempting to understand the mind. So, what do you know when you know the meaning of a word? From a cognitive perspective, you know a lot of things. Let's use the word cat as an example. You know that cats are a type of animal. They're mammals. You can form a mental image of the thing I'm referring to, its general shape and some of its other physical characteristics. Typically has 4 legs, a long tail, is furry, meows incessantly until fed. Okay, maybe the last one's just my personal experience, but that's the thing with meaning in the mind. It is personal. Part of the meaning that I tie to this word includes my previous experience with cats. I've had mostly positive experiences with cats, but I know other people who have not. I know people who are highly allergic to cats, and that feeds into what comes to mind when they encounter this word. All these pieces of information that are activated when we encounter words are part of their meaning. But as you are aware, this talk is not about cats. It's about 2 terms, fake news and propaganda. Even though Google searches for the term fake news skyrocketed following the 2016 presidential election, it seems that the term fake news had been around for approximately 125 years before that. The word propaganda, on the other hand, has been around for even longer, but it wasn't until the 1790s that it was used to refer to something like fake news. The current definition found in the Oxford English Dictionary is the systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way, in order to promote a political cause or point of view. But again, as you know, I'm not interested in dictionary definitions. I'm interested in what meanings people have in their heads. More specifically, we conducted research and we sought to answer questions like, are the terms fake news and propaganda more similar or more distinct? Also, does the way that a person defines these terms depend on their political identification? The data I'm talking about today comes from one of the studies that Dr. Michael mentioned earlier. More specifically, Study 1, with the data having been collected in March of 2017. Remember that participants rated 42 news sources on scales of fake news, real news, and propaganda. What I'm going to focus on, though, is how participants responded to the following instructions. Consider the terms fake news and propaganda. What do these terms mean to you? How are they similar and different? We conducted 3 types of linguistic analyses to analyze the definitions that people provided us with. 95% of our participants provided definitions that we could use in our analyses. To look for evidence of similarity or distinctness, we started with some simple categorization. One thing that participants did was to be explicit about whether they thought fake news and propaganda were similar or different. A similar explicit example is as follows. They are similar to me. They exist to prove an agenda rather than tell the truth. A different explicit example, on the other hand, is as follows. Fake news and propaganda are not similar at all. What we found from this categorization is that 18% of participants explicitly indicated that fake news and propaganda were similar, but only 3% of them explicitly indicated a difference. However, this difference was not statistically significant. Then we asked whether being on the left or the right side of the political spectrum makes a difference, and found no evidence to suggest that political identification was having an impact. Another way in which we categorized these definitions was by determining whether one shared definition was used to describe both fake news and propaganda, or whether two separate definitions were provided. A shared example is as follows. They are lying or making things up for views and political agenda. A separate example is as follows. Propaganda has an agenda. Fake news is for ad revenue. What we found from this categorization is that 23% of participants used one shared definition, but 72% of them provided two separate definitions. Then we asked whether being on the left or right side of the political spectrum makes a difference. Our results suggest that it did. Even though participants on the left and right sides of the political spectrum produced the same proportion of shared definitions, those on the left produced significantly more separate definitions as compared to those on the right, 80% compared to 61%. This finding suggests that those on the left might have an increased tendency to think of fake news and propaganda as distinct. Our next analysis involved using the keywords function in Wordsmith tools to compare the frequency with which particular words appeared in definitions of fake news as compared to definitions of propaganda. Using this analysis, we found 10 words unique to fake news. These words tended to be closely tied to alternative ways of saying fake news, including words associated with negation, such as false, and synonyms for news, such as facts. We also found 27 words unique to propaganda. These words tend to be closely tied to the idea of taking a particular perspective, such as skewed, and words that tap into actions and purpose, such as convince. When political identification was added to this analysis, we found some significant differences. Of most interest is the finding that fabricated was a word more often used by those on the left in their definitions of fake news. For propaganda, truth and skewed were words more often produced by those on the left, but story was used more often by those on the right. Even though there were several words that were used differently across political identification, remember that all other words not shown here are being used just as often across political affiliation. Our next analysis used the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count program, LIWC. Instead of individual words, LIWC uses psychologically relevant categories to look for patterns of words. 4 of these categories, the summary categories, are the ones we used for analysis. The first summary category we'll look at is analytical thinking, which looks at the frequency of words related to logical thinking and problem solving. This pattern suggests a difference between the definitions, such that definitions of propaganda contained more words associated with analytical thinking than definitions of fake news. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from the analysis, the significant effect of definition maintained. However, there was no significant interaction involving political identification. The next summary category we'll look at is clout. Words related to clout would show evidence of authority or confidence. The frequency with which words related to clout were produced by participants was higher for propaganda as compared to fake news, again suggesting a distinction between the two terms. When political affiliation was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from the analysis, the significant effect of definition maintained. However, there was no significant interaction. Authenticity is our next summary category. Words related to authenticity tend to indicate honesty. The two terms did not significantly differ in terms of their authenticity. Now we have some evidence of similarity again. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from the analysis, the results for authenticity did show a significant interaction. The interaction was such that definitions for fake news provided by those on the right contained more authentic language as compared to those on the left. And the opposite pattern was found for definitions of propaganda. The last summary category is emotional tone. Typically, scores below 50 indicate a negative emotional tone. Our data revealed that our participants' fake news definitions included words that were more negative in tone than our participants' propaganda definitions. This might have something to do with the use of negation words that we described earlier from the keyword analysis. At any rate, this finding again suggests a difference between the definitions tied to these two terms. When political identification was added in as a between subjects measure and participants who identified as center were removed from the analysis, we observed a significant main effect of political identification and a significant interaction. The main effect of political identification was such that emotional tone was more positive for participants on the left and more negative for participants on the right. But this difference is best explained by the interaction. Emotional tone in the fake news definitions did not differ across political identification, but emotional tone in the propaganda definitions did. Definitions of propaganda provided by those on the left were more likely to contain words with positive emotional tone than definitions of propaganda provided by those on the right. So, do we have evidence that fake news and propaganda are similar or distinct in their meanings? Well, we found some support for similar meanings. We also found some support for distinct meanings. What does this mean? What we think is that the meanings of fake news and propaganda are often overlapping, but are distinguishable. What about the influence of political identification on the meanings of fake news and propaganda? Several pieces of evidence suggest that there are no differences between political identification. However, we did find some differences. Even though separate definitions of the terms were favored overall, participants on the left side of the political spectrum had an increased likelihood of providing separate definitions as compared to participants on the right. Participants on the left used words such as fabricated to describe fake news. Participants on the left used words such as skewed and truth to describe propaganda, while those on the right used story. More authentic language was used by participants on the left when defining propaganda, and more authentic language was used by participants on the right when defining fake news. Participants on the left may feel more positively about propaganda than participants on the right. So where does this leave us? Should we just agree to disagree? Is this semantic divide just something we have to live with? But before we reach an ultimate conclusion, we need to acknowledge some of the limitations of this research. One thing to note is that individual responses varied widely. Also, asking participants to define terms is one way of trying to get at the meaning of words. However, it only lets us see the information that participants have conscious access to. What we don't yet have data about are the factors of meaning that participants might have access to at an unconscious level. We also don't have data about those factors of meaning that participants don't have the words to describe. My research lab is in the process of analyzing the extent to which these definitions change over time. We also have plans for research that utilizes other ways of tapping into the meanings of these words. Ultimately, we think that it's important to consider whether there are ways to lessen this semantic divide. Maybe one way of encouraging productive communication between groups is to have them reflect on the meanings they think are tied to particular words, especially those we spend so much time debating. So, in conclusion, arguing about whether something is fake news isn't just a matter of political opinion. It's a matter of semantics.